Welcome to Edge Hill University. If it's your first visit to the campus, a particular welcome, as it's dark and we're really not seeing it at its best, but let me assure you it is a very attractive campus and you're very, very welcome. So I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this evening for the first inaugural lecture of this calendar year. Professor Jo Crotty is Director of the Institute for Social Responsibility, and she's also a Professor of Management at the Edge Hill University Business School. Prior to joining us about 18 months ago, she had been Dean of Business and Law at Aberystwyth, having moved there from the University of Salford a few years previously. Jo is a distinguished professor. She's published over 70 journal articles, conference papers and book chapters, including prestigious outlets such as the British Journal of Management, Sociology, Non-Profit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly, and Organisation Studies. She's been awarded research funding from the ISR and from the British Academy, and she sits on the editorial board of Corporate Social Responsibility and Environmental Management Journal. She's also an academic advisor at the London Business School. We appointed her as successor to John Diamond, who had founded the Institute for Public Policy and Professional Practice in 2013. Jo has argued successfully for a rebranding of that research institute as the Institute for Social Responsibility, and she's been working creatively on developing Edge Hill's research culture in the social sciences right across the faculty structures. To that end, she has recently organised a writing retreat attended by 8 colleagues from various parts of the university. More activities of this kind are planned, and I am confident they are going to lead to a sustained raising of research aspiration throughout the university. Her topic this evening is something of which she is regarded rightly as a world expert. Its title is A Russian Retrospective, Myth, Misogyny and Management. Without further ado, Professor Jo Crotty.
Well, good evening, everybody. I think they're going to move this microphone out of the way. There we go. That was a really, really detailed and huge introduction, so hopefully I live up to that. What I'd like to do, actually, is to start by introducing you to this woman. Her name is Margarita Garacheva, and she lived in Moscow with her husband, Dmitry. They met at school and began dating after college. Initially, they were happy, though he flared up easily over trivial things, and he swore he would kill her if she was ever unfaithful to him. Their relationship soured when Margarita began working in an advertising section of the local newspaper. Despite having a degree, Dmitry could only find work driving a forklift truck, and he became resentful of her career and jealous of her male colleagues. He was increasingly cold and withdrawn. When Margarita said she thought they should split up, he ignored her, and when she produced divorce papers, he was furious. One night, he attacked her in her apartment. He accused her of cheating on him and forced her to take a lie detector test. The next time, when he threatened her with a knife, she went to the police. But the desk officer explained that women often make complaints only to withdraw them later, and that created too much paperwork. On the morning of the 11th of December 2017, 5 days after the aforementioned case was dropped for lack of evidence, Dmitry offered Margarita a lift to work. Instead, he drove her in the opposite direction towards the forest. He parked the car, dragged her from her seat, took an axe from the boot and chopped off both of her hands. He then dumped her at the local emergency room before driving to the police station and confessing to his crime, and he was eventually imprisoned for 14 years. You may have heard of this story already because Margarita actually became a bit of an international sensation for the wrong reasons, all of the wrong reasons, when this actually happened at the end of 2017. And myself, I read an article about this incident in the New Yorker, and I thought to myself, I'm an expert on the Russian Federation. I don't understand why this happened. So I started to do a little bit of sort of anecdotal research, not academic research, just research from my own knowledge. And what I discovered was in 2017, the Russian Federation decided to decriminalise domestic violence. By decriminalising it, what they said was that if you are attacked by a family member, it doesn't result in broken bones and it doesn't happen more than once a year, you will no longer be punished with a prison sentence. The maximum fine you can achieve is $530 and up to 15 days community service. That is, of course, if the judge finds for the victim, which they often don't. But I'm pretty convinced that Dimitri didn't understand the difference between, or the nuance between, what is actually in the legislation and the statement which said decriminalising domestic violence. He just thought that this was okay now. And I thought to myself, well, where was the Russian women's movement when they were passing this legislation? I'm an expert in this stuff. What happened there? And although this was a protest on the street on the day that legislation was passed, there seemed to be no mechanism in the Russian Federation to actually advocate for women's rights and to stop this piece of legislation being passed in 2017, not 1817. So I was then interested to know, well, how many women actually die in a family setting, in a domestic setting in the Russian Federation every year? And unsurprisingly, there were no official statistics that I could access myself. But Human Rights Watch estimate that around 12,000 women in the Russian Federation are killed in a domestic setting every year. This contrasts in 2017 with 173 women who were killed in the United Kingdom as a result of domestic violence. And to put that into further context, the UK has a population of 65 million, the Russian Federation 144, and I will return to the subject of the size of the Russian population a bit later. So I was rather shocked by those statements and by that story, and judging by the silence in the room, so are you. And what I want to do this evening is to think a little bit about where women's rights are in the Russian Federation right now, but to do that through a retrospective lens, to think about myself as a researcher and as a female researcher, but also because I was doing this lecture, I took the opportunity to go back through my own back catalogue and to think about what lines I can draw from my own research to the development of the Russian women's movement all the way back to the Tsarist times, to pre-revolutionary times. But before I do that, I think it's also interesting to juxtapose what is happening in Russia, or what happened in Russia in 2017 with respect to decriminalising domestic violence, to that which happened in the USA and Me Too. Because 2017 was also the year in which Harvey Weinstein and others were revealed as having used their positions of power to exert sexual violence on women for whom he had power, with whom he had power. So how is it then that all of these years, nearly 30 years after the end of the Cold War, we have two countries, two great foes, going in completely opposite directions in terms of women's rights? So, as I said, I went back as a result of doing this lecture and started to do and look at my back catalogue. And I did that alongside deciding to upskill myself in terms of the history of the Russian women's movement all the way back to 1900 and bringing that up to the present day. And of course, what I discovered in doing that is that things in the Russian Federation and the Soviet Union are never what they seem. So my PhD thesis, this is a photograph of the front cover, was intended to look at the impact of economic transition on pollution control. I was, in my spare time, an environmental campaigner back in the 90s, but I'd also worked for Pricewaterhouse, as was, which then became PwC, in the former Soviet Union in the early 90s, when it was all happening and we were moving from a centrally planned economy to a market economy. So my PhD was supposed to be a rather technical examination of what happens when you do that on pollution control in privatized manufacturing enterprises, something that had been run by the state for 70 years. You put it into a market system, what happens to pollution control and corporate social responsibility and all of those things. But because I was interested in the environment, this necessitated me looking and understanding the history of environmental regulation and what it turned out to be a tiny corner of freedom within the Soviet Union. Now, because we all, most of us, I'm assuming, but maybe not some of you in the audience, most of us grew up on this side of the Iron Curtain, where we were told and we expected and assumed that there was no ability to challenge the state, to have freedom of thought, to have freedom of expression, to have any kind of dissident group whatsoever. But I discovered in the course of my PhD that this actually wasn't the case. There was a little corner of freedom, and they were called VUP, which is the Russian acronym, or in the English acronym, the All-Russian Society for Nature Protection. And they were a group of naturalists, biologists, geographers who got together to champion the uniqueness of the Soviet environment. And they managed to find a safe place. They were founded in 1924, and they managed to survive the purges of the 1930s. And then their membership surged during the revelation of both the desiccation of the Aral Sea and potential contamination of Lake Baikal in the 60s. Particularly with respect to Lake Baikal, there have been plans by the state to build factories along the shore because it was thought that the uniqueness of the water and its purity would be very good for manufacturing. But VUP said, no way, this is unique, you can't do this, you need to stop it. And they were successful. They were successful in challenging state policy, reversing that state policy, and they survived. They weren't sent to the Gulag, they weren't interrogated by the KGB, they weren't exiled. And so what happened during Perestroika was that the environmental movement became a mass movement, and VUP became the social ecological union. It attracted thousands and thousands of members because Soviet citizens realized that this was an umbrella, a safe place with which you could express your dissent against the regime more generally. And so it was instrumental in actually bringing the Soviet Union to an end. So it went from convening these congresses, independent congresses, and this is a photo of the 6th VUP Congress in 1976, and having their student campaigners checking hunters' licenses in the 1960s, to this, the largest protest in the history of the USSR. And this took place in Menich Square just by the Kremlin in March 1991, and by the end of 1991, the Soviet Union was no more. So I thought to myself, well, when I discovered all of this, in my usual way, I went around telling everybody that there was a dissident group in the Soviet Union, most of which people just looked at me and go, why would I be interested in that? But I thought it was a really exciting find. And it challenged my assumptions about what it was I was actually about to research. And when you're a PhD student, you have that year to read, and then you realise 25 years later what a luxury having a year to read actually is. And so it challenged all of my assumptions about what my PhD was going to be about. And I decided that rather than it be a hard technical piece, I actually wanted to understand the link between economy and democracy and society and how these things are blended together. But then I read, 25 years later, I read about Margarita, and I thought, I don't know anything about the Russian women's movement. Although I think I'm an expert in Russian civil society and its development, I don't know anything about the Russian women's movement, and I don't understand why it wasn't in place to stop this piece of legislation to decriminalise domestic violence. And so I had to challenge my own assumptions again, and I decided to go back and learn about the Russian women's movement from scratch. So I decided to set myself a couple of objectives at the end of last year to extend my knowledge of the Russian women's movement and just broaden my understanding of civil society development in Russia. And also, as a result of that, I'm blending it with my previous research to make some projections about the future of women's rights in the Russian Federation more generally. And then on top of that, which I think I allude to in the poster for this event, this actually caused me then to reflect on my own experience as a female researcher in a unique environment, because believe it or not a lot of lone female women go to Russia to do research. At the time, I thought it was completely normal, but I realised later, of course, that it wasn't normal, and that's why my mother always looked so horrified when I said I was going again. So let's take you then back all the way to the beginning, and let's start with the Russian suffragettes. Most of us think of the Russian Federation as being the Bolshevik Revolution, which took place in 1917. But actually, the first revolution was in 1905, and this turned the absolute monarchy of the Tsar into a constitutional monarchy, much like our own now. It introduced a multi-party system, and along with it, all male suffrage. But in addition to this, it opened up political spaces for people to actually express dissent with the Tsar, which they had not been able to do before. And it gave a freedom of expression and a freedom of assembly that hadn't existed previously. And so women, having been left out of this new political process, took advantage of that. And they formed the Russian Women's Equal Rights League in 1905. This is a photo of them with Lev Tolstoy in 1907. It was formed by this woman, Polixenia Shishkina-Levin, and if you notice, she is hyphenating her surname. This actually stopped when, at the Bolshevik Revolution, women stopped hyphenating their surnames. She was an intellectual, and she was the first female gynecologist in Russia, in Tsarist Russia, the Soviet Union, whichever label you want to put on it. And she was the leader of this movement. And together they used a range of different techniques. They used debating clubs, they used pamphlets, They went into different education establishments, university campuses, and also started civic action and small marches in different towns and cities across Russia to get women the vote. And this actually generated some momentum to the point where 40,000 women all converged on Petrograd, now called St. Petersburg, on the 19th of March 1917, which is also my birthday, which I think is pretty cool. And this march led to them getting the vote in July 1917, making Russia only the third country in Europe to actually award women the vote at the time. So they were actually ahead of us. And this was universal suffrage, and we all know that 1918 in this country wasn't universal. But unfortunately, all of this success was then eclipsed by the Bolshevik Revolution that took place later that year in November by our calendar, or in October by the Julian calendar. And it was at this point that the advocacy for women's rights in Russia, and now what was about to become the Soviet Union, stopped being a grassroots movement. Women themselves stopped having control over who advocated for their rights. And so marches like this disappeared. Polixena, she was an intellectual, she was a member of the bourgeoisie, so she was removed, and the Russian Equal Rights League and its pamphlets and publications were shut down. And so any idea that you would have an independent grassroots movement like the Russian suffragettes also disappeared. And instead, the state now decided that it would advocate for women, and they created what were called the Zhensidels, or the Russian word is succinct, but it translates as the Women's Department of the Secretariat of the Central Committee of the All-Russian Communist Party. They have really great names for all of their committees that go on and on and on and on, and it makes them sound really important. But the Zhensidels were actually now a state-run lobby body for women's rights. And it was important for the Bolsheviks that they were run by a working-class hero, not an intellectual, not the first female gynecologist in Russia. And so Alexandra Koltonai, who was a strong ally and friend of Lenin, was put in charge of the Zhensidels. In the course of researching this lecture, there is on the BBC World Service a witness history program about Alexandra where you can hear her actually speaking. It was really cool. I thought it was cool anyway, so I listened to that. So she created these Zhensidels, if you like, in her own image, and she had a very interesting mission for these Zhensidels, that she actually went round travelling Russia with other Russian working class women, promoting a more radical reframing of the female role by emphasising their right to have a life outside of the home. And this at the time was pretty radical. And she actually succeeded in building on the work of Polixena, even though she was not an intellectual. She actually succeeded in building on their work. But the problem was, by advocating that women could have a life outside of the home, she began to be at odds with Stalin's co-objectives of growth, both in terms of population and economy. And if you said that women were going to destabilise and disrupt the traditional family unit, how are you going to have all these babies to create all these soldiers and all these workers to enact industrialisation and collectivisation? So what Stalin did was he decided there was an easier solution than having the Zhensidels and an ally of Lenin going around advocating this new agenda. He decided instead to just solve the problem by making this declaration. Women are now free and equal, emancipated, having been liberated by the revolution. Feminism is now only a bourgeois concern. So essentially, we've solved the problem, folks, and it's just them on the other side of the Atlantic who've got this problem. Women are just the same as men. And he went further and changed the Soviet Union constitution to decree that men and women were equal in all spheres of economic, political, social, and cultural life. And so as a result of that, we no longer needed Koltonai, and we didn't need the Zhensidels because there was no problem. We didn't need to advocate for women's rights because they had them all. The end. Problem solved. And actually, if you look at the rights that women obtained during this period, they are really revolutionary. So if we compare the USSR, women got the vote in 1917. They got the right to legal abortion in 1918. The Soviet Union is the first country in the world where women could legally have an abortion in a hospital. They got the right to no-fault divorce in 1918, equal pay, maternity leave, and free childcare in 1936. This compares with their great foe on the other side of the curtain, the USA. Women got the vote in the USA in 1920. This is their centenary year. But they didn't get the right to illegal abortion until 1973, no-fault divorce in 1969, equal pay in 1963, and they're still waiting for paid maternity leave and free childcare. So by any measure, the rights that women enjoyed in the Soviet Union were miles ahead of their compatriots on the other side of that Iron Curtain at the time. And of course, Stalin knew it, and he knew that he had created a great propaganda tool. He had created his own mythology, and that was the mythology of superwomen, that they were going to be producers, they were going to be present in all spheres of Soviet life and reproducers, and they were going to create these the workers for his industrialization and collective plan of the future. And he did this by using posters of this nature, where you see women doing something which traditionally you wouldn't have thought of them doing, and then men in the background, and the notion is that men and women can do exactly the same things. But actually the scarier bit of this particular poster is not the imagery, it's the legend on the side, which translates as, work, build, and do not whine. To a new life the path we'll assign, an athlete you needn't be, but physically fit a must. And I think this poster essentially encapsulates everything that Stalin was trying to do. He had completely annexed the issue of women's rights as a state issue, but also a non-issue, a problem-solved issue. But also it meant that you now had absolutely no choice. You were going to be a producer and a reproducer, you couldn't complain about it, and we were going to set you on that path. And in order to do it, the state was even going to tell you that you needed to go running around the block every night. So the state now was essentially dictating your path. But these superwomen that he created had great leverage when it came to other types of mythology, specifically Cold War mythology. And this is illustrated no better than by comparing these two women, this woman and this woman. Now the one on your right, the one in black and white, this is Valentina Tereshkova. And Valentina Tereshkova was the first woman in space. She went into space on the 16th of June 1963 in Vostok 6, and she spent 3 days in space going around the Earth. This woman here is Sally Ride, and she was the first American woman in space. And she went into space on STS-7, or the Space Shuttle as it's more commonly known, on the 18th of June 1983, 20 years later. Why did it take 20 years for an American woman to go into space? Well, there is only one man at the center of this, and that's this man. Anybody know who he is? This is John Glenn, the first American man in space. And he was part of the Right Stuff, the Mercury Astronauts. But at the time, the Americans actually had 2 parallel Mercury programs. They had one which had 12 men who were fighter pilots in either World War II or career or test pilots. And they had another program called the Mercury Women. And they had 12 pilots from World War II and career and test pilots and the same. They actually discovered that women were perhaps more predisposed to go into space. They were lighter, they ate less, and weight is a real issue when you are trying to get off the Earth. It's a real thing. Also, when they did some of the physiological tests, they discovered that women were actually more predisposed to things like G-force than men were. But because of the social proclivities at the time, a woman was never going to be the first American in space. And it wasn't Alan Shepard either, it was John Glenn. And so after he'd gone into space, they then held congressional hearings, as they are wanted to do in the US, on whether women should now go. And he went to those congressional hearings and he said the following: "The men go off and fight the wars and fly the aeroplanes and come back and help design and build and test them. The fact that women are not in this field is a fact of our social order." And with that, women were excluded from the space program for 21 years. One man. That's it. Now, you got to bet that Nikita Khrushchev knew about this and decided, right, well, here's a chance to prove once again that women in the Soviet Union can do absolutely everything. And less than a year later, Valentina was in space, and they'd also won that race. Now, before I move on from the fact that women were used as part of this Cold War mythology, and Valentina specifically, I would like to also take the opportunity to dispel a few misogynistic myths about Valentina herself. most of us who grew up on this side of the Iron Curtain were told that Valentina had no qualifications. She was snatched from a collective farm and stuck in a space rocket and sent up, put round, and then came back again just to prove that they could do it. This could not be further from the truth. Yes, she was from a collective farm, but so was Yuri Gagarin, and we would never say that he wasn't qualified to go into space. She was an amateur parachutist, as you can see from this photograph. She'd done over 100 parachute jumps before she was selected. She was a student of aeronautical engineering, which she upgraded to a PhD after she'd been into space. She was an instructor at the Yuri Gagarin Space School, both in Baikonur and Moscow, and she is now a State Duma representative in the Russian Parliament. She is an accomplished and very capable woman, so I just wanted to take this opportunity to dispel the myth that she was just stuck in a spaceship so that they could prove that we could do it. So, women in the Soviet Union, they can do anything. They can go into space, while the American housewives are still sitting around waiting to get a no-fault divorce and they can't have a legal abortion. All good, right? Then I thought, so I thought, let's go back and think back to my PhD, and when I decided to move it away from that technical thing, when I started to learn that all in the Soviet Union is not exactly what it seemed. Because when I was doing my initial PhD research, I discovered that actually the Soviet Union had some of the most progressive environmental laws in the world. No question. And I'll give you an example. The Soviet Conservation Law of 1960 in Article 223 states that the pollution of rivers, lakes and other water bodies is punishable by corrective labour and up to 1 year and a fine of 300 rubles. It is forbidden to operate factory shops or components thereof without carrying out measures to ensure purification. So this was a piece of law in 1960 that said, you, factory manager, you have real liability for what you put into the environment. And if you don't do something about it, you can be fined or go to prison. The same things did not come into UK law until 1990. So the United Kingdom Environmental Protection Act 1990 was the first piece of legislation in this country to put a duty of care on industries to actually abate the pollution that they created, and actually introduce fines and prison sentences for managers who didn't do it. So it took 30 years for us to catch up with this piece of legislation. The problem is, of course, is that this is a myth. It's a piece of law on paper, but the reality was quite different, because this progressiveness in terms of law and writing it down on paper was at a counterpoint with the other objectives of the Soviet Union itself. Also, central planning was pretty rubbish at protecting the environment because it rated the environment as zero. You were not using money or markets to assign value to things. And so nature had zero value. And so if you used nature to get rid of your externalities, it didn't cost you anything. Not only that, but the Soviet Union worked on 5-year plans, and it worked on rewarding people who met them or exceeded them. So if you use the natural environment to exceed those 5-year plans, then all the better, because meeting the plan was the most important thing to prove that the economy and this system was better than a market-based system. The environment was also used itself, much like women were, for Cold War propaganda, and Stalin had these great plans, including the Great Stalin Plan for the transformation of nature. And this was actually about rerouting, completely turning around the flow of some of the rivers that fed into the Aral Sea for agricultural irrigation. And it was this that resulted in the desiccation of the Aral Sea and turning it into a salt desert in the 60s, which VOOP suddenly became galvanized around and changed that. But the environment itself, and showing that the Soviet Union had mastery over everything, including nature, was also part of that propaganda. And so you had this progressive myth juxtaposing the propaganda machine and other messages that you needed to send. But also, not everybody in the Soviet Union was an environmental convert. And in the course of putting this lecture together, I found this fantastic quote, which goes like this. An ecologist is a healthy guy in boots who lies behind a knoll and, through binoculars, watches squirrels eating nuts. We can manage quite well without these bums. So when I found this quote, I actually used it on a few people who were not here this evening, and I read it to them and I said, who do you think said this? And who do you think they said this? Oh yes, everybody said Donald Trump. And I said, no, sorry, Nikita Khrushchev, 1957. And at one point, one guy said to me, do you know what this proves? That the world's been ruled by idiots forever, and it always will be. And I thought, you're right, I will have to share that with everybody. So of course, what does this mean in practice then? If you're rating nature at 0 and actually the mastery of nature is part of your Cold War agenda, and actually some of the people in the Kremlin not really into it anyway, what does that really mean? Well, it creates horrific outcomes. So when I was doing my PhD, I went to visit Norilsk, which in 1998 was the largest single polluter of sulfur dioxide in the world. One factory, single biggest polluter of sulfur dioxide, just the one. And I have some great photographs of Norilsk, but sadly they're on slides and they have degraded too much over time to show them. But this also resulted in Kyshtym 57. Kyshtym 57 was actually the largest nuclear accident in the world up to 1957 and beyond. It was bigger than Windscale and it was bigger than 3 Mile Island. But because it happened within the geographical limits of the Soviet Union, it was kept secret and actually not made public until the end of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 1990s. Similar to Chernobyl, an embryonic sort of trial nuclear power station had cooling problems and exploded. But worse than that, they were actually using a freshwater lake to put the radioactive waste into, and it basically created a radioactive waste, which when that dried out started to blow lots of radioactive salt around the place. When this happened, didn't actually evacuate anybody for well over a week. And because it was kept inside the Soviet Union, nobody knew about it. There was suspicion, but there were also no satellites in 1957, so it was easy to keep it a secret. And there are rumours that this was actually the target of the Gary Powers surveillance flight in the 60s, but it's difficult to no one's going to tell you if that was really the case, but there are rumours. Then, of course, there was Chernobyl, and we're all experts in Chernobyl now because we all watched the Sky HBO series last year. If you didn't, that was the best thing that was on TV last year. It was so good. But we all know about Chernobyl. We were all alive then, I think, almost. Or if not, it has kind of legendary and lasting impact. It's something that people always refer to. But it has a legacy beyond that. And this is what I was really trying to establish during my PhD research. And what I discovered is, yes, you had lots and lots of Norilsks, multiplicity of Norilski, who were producing enormous amounts of pollution. And when these markets were opened up to global competition, a lot of these factories collapsed or ceased production or reduced their production so significantly that the total quantity of pollution being produced by the Russian Federation fell dramatically. But because of decades of underinvestment or no investment in pollution abatement equipment, despite the fact that this stuff was on the books, what you actually got as a result of economic transition was pollution intensification. So the quantity of pollution per unit of output actually went up. And so even this idea that you had this sort of progressive mythology, but what was on the books didn't reflect reality, the legacy for that is huge, it's enormous, and it pervades even into today. So given that I discovered a progressive mythology during my PhD, I thought to myself, my guess is there's probably an emancipation mythology, and turns out there was an emancipation mythology. But it's not the mythology that perhaps you might think. Women in the Soviet Union openly discussed what they called the triple burden. Women were expected to be producers, to be in all walks of life, and actually they made up 48% of the Soviet workforce. But they were also expected to be reproducers, and this came into particular sharp focus during the Great Patriotic War and immediately afterwards, or the Second World War as we refer to it, where 20 million Soviet citizens were killed during the Great Patriotic War. It's a number that you can't imagine. And so women then had to become reproducers because they had lost so many people. But in addition to that, all Soviet citizens were expected to do what was called subotnik or subotniki. And this is a poster from the very first subotnik, which was on the 1st of May in 1920 to celebrate the life of Lenin. And this is, if you like, compulsory community service, compulsory volunteering. So every Saturday you would go out, clean the streets, clean the parks, do something for your community. And this then became a kind of thing that you would do every week. So the woman had to go to work full time and do all jobs. She then had to be a mother and do all the housework, and then she had to spend every Saturday doing this community service. So what did this mean? Well, It meant that women ended up, of course, working longer hours than men, that women gravitated to professions which made it easier to accommodate this triple burden, including things like banking, which had no status in the Soviet Union because banks didn't transform their assets, and healthcare. Women also, of course, didn't have the luxury that many women in the West were getting at that time in terms of reducing their number of hours in the house because of labour-saving devices like dishwashers and washing machines. The amount of time they spent in the house didn't go down that much. And also, of course, this emancipation was not extended to men. So men had to be producers and they had to do community service, but there was absolutely no expectation that they would take on 50% of the share of the housework and bringing up of children. And so as a result, women were, rather than emancipated by this system, were actually placed under a kind of triple burden. But it also meant, this emancipation myth, was also revealed in the fact that women had no voice. They had absolutely no voice to complain about this triple burden. That, as I said right back at the beginning, the minute the Bolshevik Revolution took place, the state took on advocacy for women and they had no place. They had no little corner of freedom to discuss or to think about what solutions might be for this triple burden, to actually release some of their time. The Zhenshadels had been shut down by Stalin and he had replaced them by the Zhensovieti, or the Soviet Association for Women, but they were just a state department. They weren't there to advocate for women or to change anything. And in the 60s, when a small group of women attempted, and I would guess, I've yet to verify, spurred on probably by VUP and their success with respect to Lake Baikal and the Aral Sea, decided to publish a pamphlet addressing the issue of the triple burden. They were interrogated by the KGB and they were forced to emigrate. So women needed a new operating environment. If they were ever going to address this triple burden and this emancipation myth, they were going to need a different way of operating, a different political space. And so this came with perestroika, and I think many women, and glasnost, openness, all of those things, women thought this was going to be the solution. And women did coalesce around groups in this slightly new, more freeing space to start talking about solutions. But then somebody else came up with a solution, and this was it, and it's so good I have to read it to you. Over the years, we failed to pay attention to women's specific rights and needs arising from their role as mother and homemaker and their indispensable education function as regards children. Engaged in scientific research, working on construction sites, in production and in the services, and involved in creative activities, women no longer had enough time to perform their everyday duties at home: housework, the bringing up of children, and the creation of good family atmosphere. We have discovered that many of our problems in our children and our young people's behaviour, in our morals, culture, and in our production are particularly caused by the weakening of family ties and slack attitude to family responsibilities. This is a paradoxical result of our sincere and politically justified desire to make women equal with men in everything. Now, in the course of perestroika, we have begun to overcome this shortcoming. And this is why we are now holding debates on how to make it possible for women to return purely to their womanly mission. And this solution came from man of the decade, Mikhail Gorbachev. So, sorry folks, but I've ruined John Glenn and now Mikhail Gorbachev for you in the course of this, but I don't have a slide where Barack Obama says some really nasty things about women, so you're still safe with him. And so, again, what we have here is the state saying, we've got the solution, and the solution is a reductive one. It's to say, you just need to go back to being homemakers, the end, and we made a mistake. But there's also something rather chilling that goes through this, which also says that women are the reason why all of our society is crumbling, and it's all women's fault, and what a mistake, and we need to correct that by putting them back in the home and locking the door. And when I read this, I felt rather sad, because Gorb was one of my heroes, but I'm afraid no, not anymore. Just in the same way that I felt when I found out about John Glenn. But thankfully for the Russian women's movement, this period of perestroika didn't actually last very long, and events kind of eclipsed Gorbachev's idea of trying to keep the Soviet Union intact but with more openness, and it came to an end with these marches on the 25th of December 1991. And in anticipation of that, women got together in a town outside Moscow called Dubna to convene a conference entitled Democracy Without Women is Not a Democracy. And they got ready for what they knew that was coming, which was going to be free and they hoped fair elections. But unfortunately, they didn't do so well. And in the Soviet period, they were guaranteed 33% representation in the Soviet Duma. But in the 1991 elections that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, they only gained 5.6% of the vote, 10% in 97, 7% in 1999, and today it's 16%. So democracy didn't give them the political representation that they hoped. However, those political setbacks didn't actually deter them from setting up, by the end of the 1990s, more than 2,000 separate organisations and groups that advocated for women's rights. And these groups were diverse, they were eclectic, and they were geographically dispersed, so they could be found all over the new Russian Federation. So then, you're thinking, well, that's good then. Got a women's movement, problem solved. Except, if this was a women's movement and it was successful, how did we get to the place where we decriminalise domestic violence? And this, I'm afraid, comes to the democratic myth. The myth that if you introduce free and fair elections, that makes a democracy. And I got a salutary lesson in this myself when I was a very young and enthusiastic graduate PwC trainee, and I was in a bank in the middle of Siberia, and I said to a woman, "Oh, isn't it great that you've got freedom now?" And she looked at me and said, "Well, you don't have freedom unless you have economic freedom." And at the time, I thought, oh no, I completely disagree with that. But then I walked away and realised, of course, that in the Soviet Union, you had no financial worries, you had no job security worries. You had other worries, but you didn't have those. And then in economic transition, you had completely the opposite. And so you can't just create a democracy by changing the voting system, by emancipating people. It takes way more than that. And unfortunately, this was going to be a very, very difficult project within the Russian Federation, partly because they had no history of civil society. VUP was it during the Soviet Union. They were the only group that could bridge that gap between the individual and the state to say, here is something over here that individuals are concerned about. We're coalescing together as a group and we're challenging the state to do it. They were the only third sector organisation, absolutely no history of civil society, but also no history either of being able to challenge the state directly in that way. People didn't know how to do it. And so after I finished my PhD, I became really interested in this notion of building a civil society from scratch. And so I spent a lot of time on my own and with others researching the development of the environmental movement this post-Soviet space. And what did I find? Well, I found, first of all, that economic turmoil eclipsed pretty much everything during the 90s. If you had a guaranteed income, a guaranteed holiday every year, you could always pay for your flat, you had guaranteed social safety nets, etc., and they are taken away from you overnight, then your life is turned on its head. And the Russian economy was essentially transformed through shock therapy. They let their currency float freely. They opened their markets up. They privatized all enterprises within 2 years. And so this meant that the value of people's savings was wiped out overnight because of hyperinflation. I actually lived through hyperinflation myself when I was working in Minsk during this period, and it's something which you thought was resigned to the Weimar Republic, and then you're going out at lunchtime and the exchange rate was different to what it was when you went to work, and it's different at tea time, and it's a thing to live through, to experience. And also, job security had gone, and this in itself meant that people were working probably 3 jobs when they'd only worked 1 before. And so when your economy is upside down and everything you've known is no longer there, do you think that your first priority is to join an environmental NGO? Probably not. And so the economic turmoil and the changing of people's priorities prevented the development of a real thriving civil society. Also, of course, people didn't have to volunteer anymore. They weren't compelled to volunteer. And so most people decided that they quite liked their Saturdays to their self-thanks and didn't want to step up and carry on volunteering voluntarily. And so they chose to exercise their right not to. And so because of that, most of these 2,000 women's groups, and there was the equivalent number of environmental groups that emerged, were rather fragmented and inward-looking. They were made up of friendship groups or special interest groups. What they weren't were groups that were emerging from the population to set up and then campaign and tell the state that they wanted something to happen. They were pre-existing groups, pre-existing specialists who decided to form a group where they could actually speak freely for the first time. But also there's no history of charity or donations or fundraising in the Soviet Union. And so these new little environmental movements and little groups had nowhere to go to get money to fund them, except overseas donors. And people like USAID and DFID were really, really excited to come in and give you as much money as you could. Yes, we'll help you build a democracy. We know what we're doing. And so came in and handed out bundles and bundles of money to all kinds of NGOs, not just the environment, but across the piece. But what did they do? Well, they actually imposed their own aims and goals on these organizations, not the aims and goals of the Russian population, but the aims and goals of DFID and USAID. And so, yes, we had an environmental movement, but it wasn't an environmental movement that was a mass movement. It wasn't a grassroots movement coming out of campaigning against a specific issue. And its goals were not its own. It was that of the overseas donor. And so mainly when you ask the general public about the environmental movement during this time, they said similar things to Nikita Khrushchev, and they didn't trust them and they held them in deep suspicion. Then two other things happened. The first was the election of Vladimir Putin in the year 2000, and that was then closely followed by what are referred to as the colour revolutions. And some of you may remember that in the early 2000s, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine and the Rose Revolution in Georgia. And these revolutions happened because following presidential elections, overseas NGOs had done exit polls, and they revealed that the results that were announced by the incumbents were actually wrong and that their challenger had actually won. And that happened on two occasions. Well, Putin didn't like the look of that for obvious reasons, and so he decided that he needed to curtail the activity of Russia's third sector and particularly overseas influence on that sector. And so what he did was he passed what was called the 2006 NGO law. And this actually mirrors back to this time when Stalin decided, right, women's issues are solved, and now I'm annexing them. And what this really was a piece of legislation where Putin decided to annex civil society. And myself and other authors have looked at this in some depth over the period of time, and other scholars, about the impact of this law on the development of Russian civil society. Because Putin set up what he called the Ministry of Civil Society. He decided to manage civil society for himself. He decided to create his own funding for third sector groups, for NGOs, and you had to basically engage in a competition to get state funding, which of course meant that you were more likely to get it if you were affiliated to the government. And so what we saw was an emergence of what are called GONGOs, or government organised NGOs. This piece of legislation also said that you had to register your NGO with the state and your aims and goals, and if your aims and goals weren't in line with those of the Russian Federation, you could be shut down. If you were in receipt of overseas donor money, you would be classified as a foreign agent or an agent of a foreign power and could be shut down. And then he followed this piece of legislation up with subsequent legislation limiting freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of protest, and so on. And so somehow we're sort of finding ourselves going a little bit back to full circle. And what I discovered in the discovery and the reading and the learning about the Russian women's movement is that all of these things, the economic turmoil, the rejection of volunteering, the over-reliance on overseas donor money, all impacted the women's movement in exactly the same way as the environmental movement. And the NGO law had an even a bigger effect on them because they were perhaps not the most popular. Their message was more difficult to communicate in the first place. And this was because there were three other issues that impacted the women's movement at that particular time. The first was a rejection of the conceptualization of feminism, partly because it was associated with the Soviet period for obvious reasons, but secondly because it was now being shaped not by Russian women but by overseas donors who had Western conceptualizations of what feminism was. And so there was a wholesale rejection of this notion of women's rights, something of the past and something from the West, and we don't want either of those things. Secondly, the Russian Federation and all of the countries that have been behind the Iron Curtain went into a demographic crisis when the Iron Curtain collapsed and that bloc collapsed. But the Russian Federation had it the worst. And between 1993 and 2012, their population went into negative growth every single year. Their population contracted. This was partly because people stopped having babies, but it was also because life expectancy rates dropped off a cliff. And during the 90s, it actually went down to 58 for a man. So this has started to propagate very strong counter-narratives against feminism. So rather than just a rejection of an old-fashioned or a Western concept, it's actually started to breed counter-narratives coming from people like this man, and this is Patriarch Kirill, and he is now in charge of the now resurgent Russian Orthodox Church. And he said the following in the New York Times in 2013, not 1813. I find very dangerous this phenomenon which is called feminism, because feminist organisations proclaim a pseudo-freedom of women that should first be manifest outside marriage and outside the family. Man turns his sight outwards and should work, make money, while a woman is always focused inwards towards her children, her home. If this exceptionally important role of women is destroyed, everything will be destroyed as a consequence. Family, and if you wish, the homeland. Patriarch Kirill, 2013. Not that different to the statements made by Mikhail Gorbachev that if a woman steps out of the home, we will destroy our morals, our culture, and our homeland. But the women's movement actually has a much bigger and more powerful opponent than even Patriarch Kirill, and that is Vladimir Putin himself. And he has actually cultivated an image of being the cultural icon of national masculinity. And this is because he came to power on the back of promising to re-establish Russia's role in the world and to address its economic and cultural humiliation that many felt during the 1990s. And so he has used gender deliberately to re-establish that national identity. And so he projects himself as a virile and strong leader, someone who can not only tame Russian nature, but also Russia's external enemies. And he has used photography, particularly of his summer holidays, to convey this image. And I've got some of these photos for you now. So here he is, Vladimir Putin, swimming in a lake. And he's fishing and hunting. And he's riding a horse. And you can see in all of these pictures, he's not wearing a shirt. And he's looking virile and in control. But he does sometimes wear clothes. But when he does, he holds a gun or he drives a skidoo. And so he's used his own image to say, look, this is a masculine culture and I am at the head of this. I just think when I put these up that I can't think of any other world leader that would do this. And then I thought, there's not any world leader I would want to see do this. Perhaps more to the point. But you know what? The Russians absolutely love it. They love him. He is the same age as Tony Blair, and I say this for a reason in a moment. And I've been in the Russian Federation in the year of the 50th year of his birth and the 60th year of his birth. And you go meet somebody and you have a conversation, and then at the end they say, "Ooh, before you go, let's have a toast to the 50th year or the 60th year of our leader's birth." And out comes the vodka from the bottom drawer, and you're doing a toast. And the fact that there's vodka in the bottom drawer also says that our cultures are quite different. They love him. Can you imagine toasting Tony Blair's 60th birthday? I don't think so. So this has really worked. This is the best bit of propaganda Stalin could have only imagined, that he's actually created a superman out of himself rather than creating an image of a superwoman. And what we found is that we now have this image reflected back at us. So the music have become resurgent in the Russian Federation. The music is an old Russian word that used to describe a peasant, the peasant that you always think of with the felt hat and the long beard and the long clothes. But that's not the music anymore. This is the music. The music is sturdy, tough and strong and does not talk too much, and he makes his deeds speak for him. Neither does the music share liberal values. Sexism and homophobia are not seen as vices. The music are the apotheosis of masculinity, strength, resourcefulness and ingenuity. In contrast to the effete and upper class, he is the Russian salt of the earth. And here he is, sitting on a bench in the middle of the day, drinking vodka. And I've actually been mown down by the music in Perm 3 years ago, I made the mistake of going into, you have to go to a special shop if you want to buy alcohol over a certain ABV. And I went in there at 5 to 5 to buy some vodka for a friend. And of course, when at 5:05, I was mown down by the musique coming in to buy their quart of vodka for the evening. Really, I was like pushed into the corner of this shop. So the musique really exists. And while he looks quite amusing on this photograph, it demonstrates that this has become a masculine culture from the top down, deliberately an anti-feminist, pro-natal, gender essentialist culture, country. And this is reflected not only in the culture, not only in the leader, but also in the laws that have been considered by the Russian State Duma or Parliament. So since 2010, the Russian State Duma has discussed, but not yet, and I stress the word yet, enacted, preventing women who are not mothers from attending university. Can you imagine? Equal pay legislation, but decided not to pass it. So it was enshrined within the Soviet constitution, but not in the Russian constitution. And anti-discrimination legislation, but decided not to pass it. But they have enacted the decriminalisation of domestic violence, as I said at the beginning. And they have introduced maternity capital, which only in the last fortnight they extended to all women with less than 1.4 children, and have reintroduced free school meals. So we are now living in a patriarchal culture, society, enshrined within the church and embodied within the legal process. But some of you, I'm sure, are sitting there and thinking, but it's not like that entirely, Jo, because what about Pussy Riots? What about them? And you're right, Pussy Riot was a thing. But once I decided to research Pussy Riot a bit more, I realised that actually Pussy Riot are almost about the emancipation myth. They're a kind of revisitation of that emancipation myth. For those of you who don't know about Pussy Riot, here is a picture of them. They're 3 young women in their 20s, and they went into the Cathedral of Christ the Redeemer in Moscow, which is the home of Patriarch Kirill, and they did a 30-second performance of a song they'd written themselves called Punk Prayer, Mother of God, Chase Putin Away. And this lasted for 30 seconds before they were shut down. They were arrested for hooliganism, and 2 of them were sent to a penal colony for 2 years for a 30-second protest in a church. Now, at the time, they were lauded in the West as feminists, as great protesters, and also, I think, people thought, well, if you can do that, then this means that there is some freedom for women in the Russian Federation, and it's not so bad. But actually, this performance was widely condemned in the Russian Federation, not just by conservative groups, but by liberal groups and by men and women alike. Their protest was seen as culturally inappropriate. They were inappropriately dressed. They went into a part of the church that was reserved only for men. And the language of this, that was used in this song, and they were challenging Putin, you know, the great nationalist hero, and so on, widely condemned everywhere, even within the most liberal of groups. And this, I think, acts as a warning, which I've seen in my own work, particularly looking at the nature of corporate social responsibility in Russia, that you cannot just impose Western concepts into this environment. If I speak to Russian managers about corporate social responsibility, they don't think of this as a Western concept. This was something that they did in the Soviet Union. We didn't invent it. And if they want to do it their own way and in different methods that don't comply with the Western model of CSR, well, that's just tough. That's how we do it here. And it's not a Western concept, and we've got our own way. And this also, I think, reflects some of the other things that I found more latterly. Once I started working with Sergei Lubovnikov, he was my PhD student and has now become my long-term collaborator, we started looking at the development of health and welfare NGOs in the Russian Federation. And what we discovered in the sort of 2010s, is that if you were a charity that was concerned with animals or healthcare or children or cancer, you could now raise money or fundraise in kind. You could get people to volunteer for your organisation. But no one was going to volunteer for drug or alcohol treatment. No one was going to volunteer, and the Ministry of Civil Society was never going to give you any money to work with prostitutes or prisoners. And this again reflects back the conservative nature of Russian society. I would add at this point as well that needle exchange is illegal in the Russian Federation. So again, I saw something here reflecting back on my own work. So then, I sort of bring this part of the talk to a sort of conclusion. bringing together these notions of Russia, civil society, and going right back to the beginning in terms of Me Too. It's pretty clear to me, over 20 years of researching this, that right now there is no space for an independent third sector in the Russian Federation. None at all, not for anything that would be really effective. But at the same time, there is no greater need for something like Me Too, given the story of Margarita at the beginning. But there is no political opportunity to enact Me Too as a real thing. So then that led me to another myth. How global is global? When we're told that movements that start in the West are global movements, are they really? Because there is no political space for Me Too, for those sorts of protests that we saw in the USA, in the Russian Federation right now. And so these so-called global movements need to be more than hashtags. And therefore, people like me need to use platforms like this to tell you about this, because you don't have this freedom of opportunity in the Russian Federation right now. But when you have a high-profile case like Margaritas, the international community does come together. Oh, and this is a picture of her in Germany, where they managed to reattach one hand and gave her a bionic hand for the other. So she's doing pretty well now. So I'm sure you're glad to hear that. So, as I said as well, what I wanted to do was to think about myself. And, well, yes, I was a female researcher and have been a lone female researcher many times in the Russian Federation, and before that, a graduate trainee. Did I ever feel like I was operating in a patriarchal society? Was I consciously aware of people treating me differently? And the reality is, yes, I understand that it's a patriarchal society, but being a Western woman who speaks Russian, I'm given enormous dispensation, and it's impossible for me as a researcher to experience that myself. And so what I want to do is go back this year and start to explore that some more and do some empirical research. But it also caused me, when reflecting back on this, to go back through some of my old photographs and think about some of the things that I did. And I have been really lucky to do some really, really unique things. I got to audit, here's a picture of me, I look a bit different there, my hair's a different colour. I got to work for this bank in Kemerovo in Siberia, and this was a mining bank, and I went down a Russian mine one afternoon with the team here. I got to stay in some absolutely horrific apartments. When I was doing my PhD research, this is my apartment in Nizhny Novgorod. It was not good, it had cockroaches, and I would spend all weekend looking for something to buy that I could cook to make, and I lost a lot of weight. But I also got to experience Russian nature, some places that are completely unique, but so difficult for the ordinary person to get to, like the Zhiguli National Park in Samara Oblast. The most amazing place, absolutely fabulous, all sorts of mountains like this with just views that go on for absolutely ever, because the scale of these national parks is absolutely massive. I've also got to indulge my love of 20th century history, and I've been to the 1991 memorial in Volgograd. This was constructed by Boris Yeltsin and Helmut Kohl to commemorate the soldiers that died at the Battle of Stalingrad in 1991. And these are the ones with the helmets are the only individual Russian soldiers' graves that they had any, or Red Army graves that they had real names for. But the Germans, you know, being the technocrats, they had everybody's name. And so all the names of the German soldiers that died at Volgograd are all on these cubes, and the cubes go on forever. And it's a really sobering thing when you see how many names there are. And I've also got to go to the horrific Soviet memorial, victory memorial, called Mamailov Kurgan in Volgograd, which was constructed by Stalin at the end of the Great Patriotic War because they won the Battle of Stalingrad. And it's the disembodied hand that freaks me out every time. I don't like that. But I also got to do some other things of which I don't have photographs. I went to interview some managers at the Samara Aviation Factory. This was about 15 years ago. And at the end of the interview, one of the managers said to me, "Oh, come with me, I've got something to show you. No cameras, whatever." I said, "Oh, okay," thinking, what is this? And we went round the back of the factory and into the area at the back, which looked like a kind of aeroplane graveyard. And he wanted to show me, in this graveyard, was the Topolov 144, which for the uninitiated was the Concorde-ski, the Concorde with the little moustache wings on the front. How cool, I thought to myself. Not many people have seen that. Also, at the end of the Soviet Union, they got rid of all the gulags except for one, which was Perm 36, which they kept as a memorial. And 3 years ago, I got to go to Perm 36, of which, again, I have no photos. And I learnt the difference between a gulag and a concentration camp. The gulag was designed to break you, not to kill you. It was to break you. And just if you were an intellectual counting beads all day and reading the complete works of Lenin would have broken me, for sure. And I've been to Kishtim 57. Lots of people, you can go to Pripyat now, you can go to Chernobyl, but I've been to Kishtim 57. I've also been followed by FSB officers with the newspapers, and I've had my phone calls intercepted. And my colleague was even FSB'd and was interrogated Gestapo style at 5 a.m. So working in the Russian Federation doesn't come without risks. But what I want to do this year is to go back and reflect on my own place as a female researcher and to get the views of different women from different groups, different ages, about how they perceive their own rights in this patriarchal society and where the Russian women's movement goes from here. Because this has been a bit of a retrospective, I also want to thank in absentia all of these people. It takes an awful lot of people to get a single woman to go to Russia and collect data. Both all of these universities that have supported me over the years, but also academics back in the UK, working with me, supporting me. We didn't used to have email either when I first started going, so I used to write little postcards. People write postcards to me and they would take 2 weeks to arrive. So I'd like to thank all of those people in absentia and hand it over to you. So thanks very much for listening. So I think we have a roving mic if anybody wants to ask a question. Or if I stunned you all in silence, no, phew.
Thank you very much. I was fascinated by your description of the sudden change, at the end of the Soviet Union, the start of democracy. I was wondering, ignoring the feminist dimension, do you see the parallels with our culture now, although we come from a different place? Your jobs for life have gone, the gig economy, secure pensions have gone, and perhaps the echo chamber effect of social media would become very inward looking. I wonder if you see any parallels between the two situations.
I think there are, but this was really extremists. So the idea of, it was called shock therapy, that's what it was called, and within 2 years they had privatised over 100,000 enterprises. I mean, you remember how long it took to privatise British Gas? You know, it took months, that was one, and they managed to do this within 2 years. They let their currency freely float. You might recall that it used to be a nominal £1 equaled 1 ruble. Well, at one point it was up to tens of thousands, and they decided to take 3 noughts off the banknotes because it was, it was getting out of control. And also, most of these factories, what you had in the Soviet Union was this idea of one factory, one town. So you would build a factory, some of which would employ 20,000 people. It's difficult to imagine. And then that factory would own all the flats for all the workers and provide the social club and the kindergarten and the healthcare and all of these things. So you had whole towns dependent on one factory. Once you open that up to global competition, well inside, past the Urals, there's no way that firm could compete in that environment. So you're not just shutting the factory down, you're shutting down the whole community. And what happened in that situation was that rather than fire people, what they did was they just kept people on the books but stopped paying them or paid them in kind. And if you'll indulge me with a little story that really, I think, encapsulates that. I was walking to interview somebody at the end of the tram line during the 1998 sort of financial crisis, and there was a man standing on the side of the road, and he had a tins of paint on the bonnet of his car. And he gestured to me to say, "Would you like to buy a tin of paint?" And as I had no need for one, I said, "No, thank you." Anyway, the translator was with me. She said, "Do you know what's going on there?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, that man he works at the factory that makes the paint, and he's been paid of tins of paint, and now he's standing on the side of the road trying to sell them." And that story, I still find that story really hard to tell. It really impacted me as a person in my 20s, and I realised that everybody has the right to earn a living and create their own identity and not have to stand on the side of the street and sell tins of paint. So do I think it's as extreme as that? No. It's really, shock therapy and the legacy of shock therapy will have that tail, that until that generation aren't here anymore, the impact of going from something where everything in your life was guaranteed to nothing being guaranteed overnight within 2 years. That is not the same as us moving away from some of the things you alluded to. And you're right, I am assuming, are part of the richest ever generation, and that won't be me. But I'm never going to live through an experience like that, and nor would I want to.
Здравствуйте.
Yeah.
I studied at SEAS. I finished a year ago. So it's nice to come to a Russian lecture. I'm not going to say nostalgic, wasn't that long ago. So I've travelled to Russia. I've got friends in Russia. I love Russia. Sad about politics.
Afraid so, yes.
Yeah, but I read, I mean, you must have seen, I haven't done any more research into it, but you know, Vladimir Putin, he decided to resign. I mean, Medvedev, I don't know much about him either. I found this hilarious government website where it was written in really bad English, and it was kind of like parody. It was kind of like a timeline of Vladimir Putin, but then it was. So then Vladimir Putin allowed Medvedev to be in here, and then he went away, then he came back, then he took power again. But it was kind of written like a parody. So, I mean, what's your vision for Medvedev's government, and what's Putin up to? Did he really resign, or is it all kind of fun and games? What comes next?
Well, he didn't resign. He's still going to be there until 2024 when his term ends. But what he wants to do is he said that he wants to change the constitution. At the moment, you can only serve 2 consecutive terms as president, but you're not precluded from running again if you take a break. Thankfully, the US Constitution does not have that in it. Yet. So what he did was he served 2 terms, and then he had to step down, and Medvedev took his place. But what you found during that period is, rather than pictures of Medvedev being in everybody's office, there was a picture of the 2 of them together as he stepped down and was the prime minister. That said, Medvedev was actually a very good personal friend of Barack Obama, and there was chitter-chatter for a time that he might challenge Putin and not step aside for him when his term was up, but would take a very brave person to do that, I think. And so when Medvedev's first term was up, he stepped aside, and Putin then ran again for 2 further terms. What he's done in the last couple of weeks is said that he's going to limit that. He's going to make that role term limited. But he also has an administrative council, and there are conversations that Medvedev has now become the chair of that administrative council. He's put in place the head of the tax authority as his new prime minister. And when he gets to the end of his term, he will become the council, the head of the administrative council. And the president cannot really operate without the approval of the administrative council. So it's a sort of veneer of democracy or democratic, or making the presidency term limited whilst trying to maneuver your way into still continuing to keep control. But what I always think is interesting about the Russian Federation now is they always sort of tip a hat to the idea that they want to be taken seriously as a country. They don't want to be perceived as a tin pot dictatorship. They want to be taken seriously. So they always tip one hat or one area to saying, oh, we've got transparency, we're a democracy, we do this, we do the other, when really they're not doing that, but they don't want to get chucked out of the club. And they have been chucked out of the club, as you know. They've been chucked out of the Olympics and all kinds of other things, but they don't want to get chucked out of the really important clubs. So that's why they maintain this veneer of democracy when really it's a managed democracy at best. Does that? I hope that answers your question.
I mean, my brain's buffering. But thank you. Спасибо.
Спасибо. Lady at the front.
Hello. Thank you for the lecture. I'm a Russian person here. So there is so many things that I can say, but there is one thing that I think is missed. It's not really a question as such. It's maybe a bit of an addition. When you were showing the pictures of Putin riding the horse on, like, with his bare chest and all that, and you were talking about the notion of muzhik, or like a real man or macho or whatever, and with a picture of those, to me, alcoholics sitting on a bench, drinking whatever, You know, to me, this is funny. I don't take it seriously. I don't like Putin. I can't be caught on that. And you said, oh, Russians love him, and probably the majority does. But then there comes the division, which probably was still going on, is still going on from the Soviet times, between intelligentsia, or intelligent people, and people from, what did you say, kolkhoz, collective farm, what is it in English? Like working class people, which, I mean, there is nothing, absolutely nothing wrong with working class people, but you know, people don't get a lot of education in like collective farms, and the ones on the top, they find the way of manipulating mostly those type of people, and those who manage to get some education and have some, I don't know, some maybe like reflective and critical skills, they can't be caught on that. It's just kind of, was there something about the role of intelligentsia, or like intelligent, it's a very bad translation into English, that you can say, you know, what would, because that kind of stands completely out of the majority of people who do love Putin, and this is why he gets lots of votes, but there are, you know, other reasons why he gets so many votes. But yeah, is there something that you can think can be said about the role of intelligentsia?
Well, I think you're coming to get the microphone. I think that usually intelligentsia operates in an open civil space, and there isn't an open civil space. So that means that it's difficult to assert alternative agendas when you don't have an open civil space. My guess is there, of course, and this is 1 hour overview, 100 years, but if you have at the moment a very contrary view to the prevailing culture and the leader, you know yourself how dangerous that would be to pursue that in any overt and public way. You know that journalists have been murdered, you know that leaders of the opposition have been murdered. So you know yourself how difficult and how dangerous it would be to do that, because the civil space is not open. So of course there will be intelligent people who can see through Putin, but right now they have very, very limited space with which to lever that or to challenge him directly. I think there was another question. Oh, we're out of time. Sorry, folks, we're out of time. Of course, I'm going to be around, so I'm happy to answer any other question with you directly. And thank you so much for being like a really amazing audience. And I'm sorry if I destroyed some of your heroes, but there we are. Thanks very much.